A bias is a tendency on the part of individuals or groups to favor or disfavor certain ideas or certain practices or certain social or cultural norms and values. In terms of research, there are various types of biases that could occur in the process of research and that could impact the process of research. And one of those is the social desirability bias in research. So, what is social desirability bias? What are its causes and consequences? And what are some of the things that we can do in order to reduce the impact of this kind of bias in our research? So, first, social desirability bias is basically a bias, so it's a tendency on the part of the research participants to respond to questions, for example, interview questions or survey questionnaire questions, to respond to those questions in a manner that they believe will be viewed favorably by others. So instead of responding to the questions with authentic responses or with factual responses, they gave responses that they think will be taken more favorably, and so the bias actually distorts the truthfulness or accuracy of the responses. Generally, this bias occurs because the participants give answers that reflect socially accepted behaviors or norms or attitudes. So there are certain behaviors, norms or attitudes in particular societies that are socially acceptable. So instead of truly representing the feelings and behaviors of the respondents, they are kind of giving political answers to those questions. The social desirability bias could also be because of the researchers' tendency to present socially desirable outcomes from their research studies instead of presenting the actual results of their research studies. So now, what are the causes of the social desirability bias in research? There are several causes that lead to social desirability bias in research. One of them is cultural and social norms. So as we know that researchers conduct research in particular societies and in particular cultures. And so people who are actually participants in the research, they can come up with answers to the questions that are in line with the cultural or social norms rather than representing the true reality. For example, there could be questions related to particular social norms, to particular ideologies, religious ideologies, political ideologies, or social norms, that those answers actually come as keeping in view the acceptance of those views in the society rather than the true representation of the participants' views. Secondly, in many cases, the respondents gave responses because of fear that they will be judged in a particular way or that they will be stigmatized. Again, there are many social, cultural, ideological, religious kind of topics that when you ask questions related to those, the respondents might give distorted type of answers so that they are not judged or they are not stigmatized, especially in case their identity is not actually protected. Then the desire to please the researcher or the society. Again, this is something that leads to social desirability bias. So instead of again giving factual or truthful answers, the aim is to please the researcher or the society around. The other thing that can be a cause of social desirability bias is the lack of anonymity. So in many cases, if you keep the respondents anonymous, they might be able to give more accurate or truthful answers because they do not fear that they will be recognized. But if they are not anonymous, then because of fear or because of judgment or stigma, they might not be able to give accurate answers or truthful answers. Then perceptions of social expectations. Again, this is something that is related to social norms. There are certain social expectations where certain questions are answered or they are expected to be answered in certain ways. And so the respondents answer those questions in those ways or respond to the surveys in those ways. Now, what are the consequences of social desirability bias in research? So as we know that research is basically a process of searching for truth, finding truth, and remaining objective in the process of research. But because of the social desirability bias, what can happen is that the researchers get will be distorted, because data will not be the true representative of the truth or the true representative of the actual perceptions of the participants. Secondly, there are threats to validity because of social desirability. Data is valid when the respondents give accurate and true answers rather than answers that they think are socially acceptable. So that's why the validity of the data will be impacted because of social desirability bias. Next, over-representation of socially acceptable views. Again, the researchers can actually, in some cases, they might get accurate data, but they can bring in or they can emphasize the data in the set of data that they have collected that is more acceptable socially, or that is representative of the socially more acceptable views. So over-representation of that kind of data in our research could also lead to social desirability bias. Lack of authenticity. Again, this authenticity could be compromised on the part of the researcher if they are asking questions that are not getting them the accurate or factual or true data. Or this authenticity could also be compromised if the participants are not coming up with truthful information related to the topic that the researchers are exploring. And lastly, misleading recommendations for policy and practice. Because the data is distorted, the results will not be representing the true the true face of the reality. And as a result, the recommendations that actually are based on the findings and conclusions of the data. So if the data is distorted, if the data is incorrect, the result will be that recommendation for policy and practice will be misleading and inaccurate. So these are some of the consequences. Now, there are certain ways in which social desirability bias could be handled in research context. One of them is that anonymity and confidentiality. So if the participants remain anonymous, or if the researchers know the individual identity of the participants, but they ensure the participants that their individual identity will not be known, will not be actually reported in the research report. In that case, the participants might give more accurate data, more truthful data, and so that can actually aid to, that can counter social desirability bias. Secondly, instead of direct questioning, where the respondents will be more cautious and more political in their responses, if the researchers are experienced researchers and they come up with indirect questions, where they are, you can say, taking the answers or getting the answer from the participants without the participants actually consciously thinking about giving socially acceptable answers. That is something that can actually counter social desirability bias. Then social desirability scales, there are certain scales that they can use in order to check their questionnaires or their data collection tools for ensuring the decrease of social desirability bias in their data collection. Neutral framing of questions or implicit measures. Again, this is something related to like indirect questions. So instead of leading the respondents to answer in a particular way, the researchers are asking neutral questions where there is more objectivity in terms of response from the participants. So this can actually work towards reducing social desirability bias. Mixed method approach or triangulation, where you are collecting data through more than one ways, for example through questionnaires and through interviews, or maybe you combine interviews with observations. That can also reduce the possibility of social desirability bias, because you are actually confirming the data or the information from more than one sources, and so you are not dependent on one source, for example only on interview or on questionnaire. So that is something that that will actually deal with social desirability bias. Lastly, social desirability bias, as we know, that is dependent on mainly on the respondents' response to questions. That is why if there is more rapport and trust between the researcher and the respondents or the participants of the research, what will happen is that the respondents will be able to be more open about, to be more objective in their responses to questions. And so rapport and trust will aid to the authenticity and validity of the data that is coming, that the researcher is actually collecting. So these are some of the ways in which social desirability bias could be dealt with in social science